the most unhinged guest Johnny Carson ever had. For 30 years, Johnny Carson was the unflappable king of late night, the consummate professional who could charm presidents, calm nervous starlets, and trade witty banter with comedians. But even television's greatest hosts occasionally met his match when guests went completely off the rails. Behind Carson's famous smile and seemingly effortless control lurked moments of pure television chaos, when celebrities ignored the unwritten rules of the talk show format and descended into behavior so shocking that even the unshakable Carson couldn't hide his discomfort. Today, we're revealing the jaw-dropping moments when Johnny's famous composure was tested by guests who weren't just eccentric. They were absolutely unhinged. In an era before publicists micromanaged every celebrity appearance, these wild, unpredictable encounters created the kind of raw television magic that would be impossible today. From drunken tirades to physical altercations, from shocking sexual comments to dramatic walkouts, these are the guests who pushed Carson to his limits and created unforgettable moments of late-night insanity. Let's count down the 10 most out-of-control guests who made Johnny Carson earn every penny of his legendary salary. And critics are saying some very nice things about a performance in his latest film called Raw Deal. Here is Arnold Schwarzenegger. Music, Arnold Schwarzenegger. The bodybuilding cringe, 1979. Long before he was a Terminator or the governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger was a brash young bodybuilder with Olympic-sized confidence and virtually no filter. His 1979 appearance on The Tonight Show to promote the documentary pumping Iron caught Johnny completely off guard with its shocking sexual frankness. The young Austrian arrived on stage with the swagger of someone already accustomed to adoration. Carson, always comfortable with athletes, began with standard questions about training regimens and competition. But when Johnny innocently asked Schwarzenegger to describe the sensation of the pump, the blood flow to muscles during intense workouts, Arnold's response created what might be the most uncomfortable moment in Tonight Show history. The pump is like having sex with a woman and coming, Schwarzenegger declared with absolute conviction. But he didn't stop there, continuing with graphic details comparing muscle engorgement to orgasm using terminology that was absolutely forbidden on 1970s network television. I am coming day and night. It's terrific, he exclaimed as the camera caught Carson's expression, transforming from polite interest to genuine horror. The audience reaction was immediate. A shocked silence fell over the studio. In an era when even married couples were still shown in separate beds on television dramas, this level of sexual explicitness was completely unprecedented. Carson, the master of sly innuendo and double entendre, looked genuinely thrown by Schwarzenegger's graphic comparison. "Well, I certainly wouldn't know about that," Carson finally replied, tugging nervously at his tie, a gesture longtime viewers recognized as a signal of extreme discomfort. What made the moment particularly jarring was Schwarzenegger's complete obliviousness to the social norms he just shattered. While Carson attempted to steer the conversation back to safer territory, Arnold continued describing his physique in aggressively sexualized terms, seemingly unaware that he had crossed a line that even the relatively permissive Tonight Show wouldn't tolerate. Behind the scenes, producers were frantically signaling Carson to wrap up the segment. According to longtime Tonight Show writer Raymond Smith, the control booth was in total panic mode. The phone started ringing with network executives demanding to know what the hell was happening. Carson, ever professional, managed to redirect the conversation toward Schwarzenegger's competitive achievements, but the damage was done. When the segment finally ended, Carson reportedly turned to Ed McMahon during the commercial break and said, "I think we just got pumped in a way the FCC isn't going to appreciate." The audience, initially shocked into silence, eventually responded with nervous laughter, not so much at Schwarzenegger's comments, but at Carson's visible discomfort. It was one of the rare occasions when Johnny's legendary composure was genuinely shaken on air. What's remarkable about this appearance is that it didn't derail Schwarzenegger's budding entertainment career. In fact, some argue that his unfiltered confidence, however inappropriate for the venue, demonstrated the charismatic force of personality that would eventually make him a box office titan. As one producer noted years later, he just didn't know the rules yet, or maybe he just didn't care. Carson never referenced the incident publicly afterward, but Schwarzenegger was not invited back to Tonight Show for several years. When he eventually returned in the mid-1980s as a rising Hollywood star, he was noticeably more media-trained, though no less confident, and Johnny, with the weariness of man who'd been burned before, steered very clear of any questions about the pump. Would you welcome Burt Reynolds? And it's good to have him back here. Would you welcome Dom DeLuise? Burt Reynolds and Dom Dees. The Whipped Cream Fight, 1974. Carson generally enjoyed having Burt Reynolds on The Tonight Show. The mustachioed sex symbol was charming, quick-witted, and told great Hollywood stories. But when Reynolds appeared alongside his comedian friend Dom DeLuise in 1974, what started as a standard interview devolved into one of the most chaotic scenes ever broadcast on late-night television. The trouble began innocently enough. DeLuise, known for his physical comedy, had brought a can of whipped cream ostensibly to demonstrate a cooking technique he was famous for. But mischief was clearly on the menu from the beginning, as DeLuise winked conspirator ally at Reynolds while explaining his culinary expertise to Carson. "I have a feeling this isn't going to be about cooking," Carson remarked with the precious of a man who had hosted thousands of celebrities. But even he couldn't have predicted what happened next. Without warning, DeLuise began spraying the whipped cream at Reynolds, who responded by grabbing a pitcher of water from Carson's desk and emptying its entire contents down DeLuise's pants. The audience erupted in shocked laughter as the two friends engaged in what quickly became an all-out food fight. Carson, initially amused by the hijinks, became visibly alarmed when the battle spilled literally onto him. Reynolds, caught yuping the moment, grabbed a can of whipped cream and turned on the host, spraying a line directly across Carson's immaculate suit. "That's a $500 suit," Carson exclaimed, a rare moment of genuine irritation breaking through his professional demeanor. But it was too late. The set had descended into complete anarchy. Johnny's smile never disappeared, but anyone who watched him regularly could see the difference between his real laugh and his "I'm going to murder you during the commercial break" laugh, recalled Tonight show writer Pat McCormick. This was definitely the latter. What viewers at home couldn't fully appreciate was the extent of the chaos. By the time the segment ended, the famous Tonight Show carpet was soaked, Carson's desk was dripping with cream, and the host's expensive suit was ruined beyond salvation. Even more problematic was the fact that Carson had 3 more guests scheduled that evening, all of whom would now have to navigate a sticky, wet set. During the commercial break, Carson was heard muttering to his producer, "This is why I should never book friends. They think they can get away with murder." The cleanup was so extensive that the next segment was delayed, forcing NBC to extend the commercial break, a rare disruption to the show's precisely timed format. When cameras returned, Carson had changed his suit jacket and attempted to restore order, but the damage was done. The remaining interviews that night were conducted with visible stains on the carpet and furniture, with Carson occasionally making pointed references to the hurricane that just hit our set. What made this incident particularly unique was that it represented one of the few times when Carson temporarily lost control of his own show. Unlike most Unhinged guest moments, which involve a single unpredictable celebrity, this was a coordinated assault on the show's decorum and on Carson himself. In the aftermath, Reynolds sent Carson a peace offering, a new suit to replace the one that had been ruined. DeLuise reportedly sent a case of industrial-strength carpet cleaner to the studio. Carson, whose ability to find humor even in moments of chaos was legendary, referenced the incident in his monologue the following night. "We've had a slight change in our format. Tonight's show is now brought to you by Swiffer and Stanley Steamer." Despite the mayhem they caused, both Reynolds and DeLuise were invited back to the show numerous times, though notably never again together. As Carson later quipped to an audience member who requested a reunion, "I can't afford the cleaning bills." Sing Like Our Country became Behind the Iron Curtain, and so we all were lucky enough. Zaza Gabor showed off a bikini from her purse. Hungarian-born actress and socialite ex-Gabor made over 100 appearances on The Tonight Show, reliably delivering the kind of old-school Hollywood glamour and outrageous anecdotes that Carson appreciated. But even Johnny was left speechless during a notorious 1979 appearance, when Gabor decided to share not just stories, but actual evidence of her colorful romantic history. The segment began typically enough with Gabor entering in a cloud-off perfume, and Furs calling Carson Dalink in her trademark Hungarian accent and settling in for what viewers expected would be her usual tales of divorces and diamonds. Gabber had been married 8 times by this point and was never shy about discussing her conquests. About 5 minutes into the interview, Carson innocently asked about her recent vacation to the south of France. What happened next left even the unflappable host momentarily stunned. Gabber suddenly reached into her purse and triumphantly pulled out a skimpy gold bikini. "This Johnny darling is what I was wearing when I met my 4th husband on the beach at Cannes," she announced to the visibly startled Carson. "Or was it my 5th? No matter." The audience erupted in surprised laughter as Gabber held up the barely there swimwear for the cameras. Carson, reaching for his water glass, managed a week that's certainly compact, but Gabber was just warming up. Still holding the bikini, she launched into a detailed account of the sexual escapade that followed her beach encounter, describing how her future husband had been unable to resist her in this particular swimsuit. "The minute he saw me in this Johnny, he followed me to my hotel and knocked on my door. And let me tell you, Dink, he did not come to borrow sugar," Gabber declared with a suggestive flutter of her eyelashes. As the audience howled, Carson attempted to steer the conversation back to safer territory, but Gabber was unstoppable. She proceeded to name several famous men who had supposedly also appreciated hair in the gold bikini, including some who were very much married at the time of her alleged encounters with them. The network censor was having a coronary in the booth. Remember Tonight Show associate producer Michael Sloan. We had no delay button back then. Whatever Zazia said went straight to millions of American homes. Carson, whose interviewing style typically encouraged celebrities to be candid, found himself in the unusual position of trying Torian in a guest. "Zuza, I think some of these gentlemen might prefer these stories remain private," he suggested gently. Gabber swatted away his concern with a bejeweled hand. "Privacy is for ugly people, darink. When you look like Zaza, you want the world to know." The incident became even more surreal when Gabber insisted that Carson hold a bikini top against his chest, creating an image that would be replayed in night show highlight reels for decades to come. Carson, trapped between maintaining his dignity and keeping the segment entertaining, reluctantly complied, his expression a complex mixture of amusement and mortification. What made Gabber such a uniquely unhinged guest was her complete immunity to embarrassment or social boundaries. Unlike other out-of-control celebrities who were affected by substances or anger, Gabber was simply uninhibited by conventional limits that governed television appearances in that era. She didn't care about filters or formats, recalled Tonight Show writer Raymond Smith. Zaza operated entirely on her own frequency. Johnny could usually guide a conversation wherever he wanted to go, but with her, he was just along for the ride. By the time the segment ended, Carson's usual cool demeanor had been replaced by the slightly dazed expression of a man who had survived a hurricane. As the show cut to commercial, he was seen carefully handing the gold bikini back to Gabber, using just his thumb and forefinger, as though even touching it might implicate him in her scandalous tales. The following day, Carson reportedly received several angry phone calls from famous men mentioned in Gabber stories. His standard response became, "Gentlemen, I'm just the host. I have asthma control over Zaza Gabber as I do over natural disasters. I want to whistle something." Applause. "What is it, dear? It's so nice to see you." "Did you Red Fox stormed off over a cigarette ban?" Comedian Red Fox was riding high as the star of the hit sitcom Sanford and Son when he appeared on The Tonight Show in 1975. Known for his raunchy nightclub act and volatile temperament, Fox was considered a booking coup for Carson, who admired the comedian's groundbreaking career. But what should have been a friendly conversation between two entertainment legends instead became one of the most awkward walkouts in television history. The trouble began before Fox even made it to famous Tonight Show couch. A chain smoker who was rarely seen without a cigarette, Fox arrived backstage and was informed by a production assistant about NBC's recently implemented no-smoking policy on the set. The comedian's reaction was immediate and explosive. "No smoke, no joke." Fox reportedly declared loud enough that Carson waiting in set could hear the commotion from behind the curtain. Tonight, show producer Frederick Diordova attempted to defuse the situation, explaining that the policy was network mandated and not up for negotiation. Witnesses described Fox becoming increasingly agitated, pacing backstage and muttering about disrespect while the commercial break that would precede his introduction continued. What viewers saw when the program returned was Carson introducing Fox with his typical warm enthusiasm. The comedian walked out, shook Carson's hand perfunctorily, and took his seat. But television audiences immediately sensed something was wrong. Fox's body language was tense, and instead of engaging with Carson's first question about his hit show, he immediately addressed the smoking issue. "Johnny, they tell me I can't smoke out here," Fox said abruptly. "I've been smoking on television for years. What's the problem now?" Carson, caught off guard by having an off-camera dispute brought directly on air, attempted to smooth things over. "Well, Red, it's a new network policy. I don't make the rules around here." He chuckled uneasily, trying to move the conversation forward. But Fox was not to be pacified. "It's about respect, man. I've been in this business 30 years. If Dean Martin can drink on his show, why can't I smoke on yours?" The audience, sensing real tension rather than staged comedy, fell uncomfortably quiet. Carson, a smoker himself, who frequently used cigarettes during interview segments in earlier years of the show, tried a different approach. "Tell you what, Red, let's talk about your successful series, and maybe after the show, we can both sneak outside for a smoke." "I'm feeling the urge myself," Carson offered, attempting to use humor to diffuse the situation. It was the wrong strategy. Fox stood up abruptly, straightening his jacket. "No, man, this is wrong. I don't perform where I'm not respected." What followed was one of the most uncomfortable moments in the Tonight Show's history. With cameras rolling live, Fox turned to Carson and said simply, "Sorry, Johnny. No smoke, no joke," repeating his backstage declaration. Then, without another word, he walked off the set. The audience gasped. Carson, in a rare moment being visibly flustered, turned to Ed McMahon with a genuinely shocked expression. "Well, Ed," he said after a moment of stunned silence, "I guess we're going to commercial a bit early tonight." When the show returned from a hastily inserted commercial break, Carson handled the awkward situation with his characteristic grace. "For those of you wondering what happened to Red Fox, so am I." The audience laughed nervously, and Carson continued with his remaining guests. Though the incident cast a pall over the rest of the broadcast behind the scenes, the situation was even more chaotic. "It was an absolute nightmare," recalled stage manager Joseph Petta. "We had no backup plan because no one walks out on Johnny Carson. It just wasn't done. The producers were in a complete panic." The fallout continued after the show. NBC executives were furious about the incident, both because of the embarrassment to their flagship program and because Fox was a star of one of their most successful sitcoms. Carson himself was reportedly angered not by Fox's desire to smoke, but by his willingness to create an uncomfortable situation on live television. "Johnny valued professionalism above all else," explained longtime Tonight Show writer Raymond Smith. He felt that whatever disagreements might occur backstage, once the cameras rolled, you put on a good show for the audience. Fox violated that cardinal rule. The incident became a legendary moment in late-night television, one of the few times a guest simply walked out mid-in. It would be years before Fox was invited back to The Tonight Show, and relations between the comedian and Carson remained cool afterward. As Carson later told a colleague, 30 years in television, and I've learned one thing for sure: never open with a question about smoking. Two boys in that film were really remarkable because Blake and the other fellow was Truman Capote. High, incoherent, and sloppy. Truman Capote's appearances on The Tonight Show traced the brilliant writer's tragic decline from literary lion to troubled celebrity. In his early visits during the 1960s, following the publication of In Cold Blood, Capote was witty, articulate, and engaging, exactly the kind of guest Carson appreciated. But his 1975 appearance painted a devastatingly different picture, creating one of the most uncomfortable interviews in the show's history. By the mid-1970s, Capote's struggles with alcohol and drugs had become public knowledge. Nevertheless, Carson, who admired Capote's literary genius, continued to welcome him as a guest. The author's November 1975 appearance, however, tested even Carson's legendary interviewing skills. From the moment Capote walked onto the set, it was clear something was seriously wrong. He moved unsteadily, requiring assistants to reach his chair. His speech was noticeably slurred and his gaze wandered unfocused around the studio. Carson's expression upon greeting him registered momentary shock before he composed himself. Truman appeared not just under the influence, but almost in another dimension entirely, recalled Tonight Show associate producer Michael Blake. The makeup department had done their best, but there was no disguising his condition. His eyes were glassy, his complexion was gray, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Carson began with a simple question about Capoe's latest writing projects. What followed was a rambling, nearly incoherent response that lasted several excruciating minutes, during which Capoe referenced people who weren't present, events that hadn't happened, and at one point appeared to forget he was on television at all. "I'm working on, the thing with the beautiful people who betrayed me," Capoe mumbled, apparently referencing his unfinished novel, Answered Prayers, excerpts which had recently scandalized New York society. They're all going to be sorry when I finish telling the truth about their dirty, dirty secrets. Carson, realizing the interview was rapidly derailing, attempted to focus Capoe with more specific questions. But the writer continued to drift, at one point pulling out a crumpled handkerchief and dabbing at his forehead, while leaving a smear of makeup on his temple that remained visible throughout the segment. The audience's reaction shifted from initial amusement to uncomfortable silence as it became increasingly apparent that they were witnessing not entertainment, but a public breakdown. Carson, ever sensitive to these shifts of mood, tried to maintain dignity, both Capote's and the show's, by treating the writer's ramblings as though they made perfect sense. Johnny was like a man trying to keep a drowning person afloat, observed director Frederick Cordova later. He kept throwing out lifelines in the form of easy questions, hoping Capoe would grab onto something coherent, but nothing worked. The most disturbing moment came when Carson asked about Capoe's friendship with convicted murderer Perry Smith, one of the subjects of In Cold Blood. Capoe's demeanor suddenly changed, his eyes welling up with tears as he spoke about Smith in the present tense, apparently forgetting that Smith had been executed a decade earlier. "Perry understands me better than these so-called friends in New York," Capoe said, his voice cracking. "He's the only one who doesn't want something from me." Carson, recognizing the interview had moved beyond salvaging, gently signaled to his producer for an early commercial break. As the cameras cut away, Carson was seen leaning toward Capoe, placing a steadying hand on his arm with genuine concern. It wasn't a conversation. It was a public breakdown, recalled audience member Margaret Wilson. What made it especially sad was watching Carson try to protect Capoe from himself. You could see he genuinely cared about the man's dignity. When the show returned from commercial, Capoe had been quietly removed from the set with Carson smoothly transitioning to his next guest without mentioning the author's abrupt departure. It was a masterclass in professional damage control. Behind the scenes, the Tonight Show staff had arranged for Capoe to be escorted to his hotel with Carson personally, ensuring that someone would stay with a clearly impaired writer. Johnny was genuinely worried about him. Remember production assistant Thomas Lewis. He kept saying, "Make sure he's not alone tonight. Make sure someone's watching out for him." The incident was particularly poignant because Carson, unlike many in Hollywood, recognized Capoe's appearance not as fodder for gossip, but as a troubling sign of a brilliant mind in decline. He never mocked the interview afterward or included it in any retrospectives of the show. Years later, when asked about difficult guests, Carson would occasionally reference the appearance obliquely. "Sometimes people aren't at their best when they come on the show. When that happens, my job isn't to exploit it, but to get everyone through it with as much grace as possible." The Capoe interview remains a sobering reminder how the pressures of fame, combined with personal demons, can lead to a public unraveling, and how a truly professional host responds with compassion rather than exploitation when faced with human frailty. Well, when I'm doing a show, when I'm going on tour, or if I'm doing a movie, I collaborate with whoever the clothes designer is. Madonna flirted aggressively and got bleeped. When Madonna appeared on The Tonight Show in May 1987, she was at the height of her provocateur phase. Her Who's That Girl tour was about to launch, and her deliberate courting off controversy had already established her as pop culture reigning boundary pusher. But even Carson, who had interviewed thousands of celebrities over his career, seemed unprepared for Madonna's determination to shock his largely middle American audience. From a moment she walked on stage in a black lace outfit that barely met broadcast standards, it was clear Madonna had no intention of delivering the standard talk show appearance. Rather than taking her seat at a respectful distance, she immediately positioned herself unusually close to Carson, invading his carefully maintained personal space. Johnny was famous for controlling the physical dynamics of interviews, explained longtime Tonight Show director Frederick Dordova. He would indicate exactly where guests should sit, maintaining a precise distance that allowed for conversation without intimacy. Madonna completely ignored these unwritten rules. The interview quickly escalated from merely flirtatious to overtly sexual. When Carson asked about her upcoming film, "Who's that girl?" Madonna responded not with the typical promotional talking points, but with surprisingly explicit description of a scene that had been cut for being too risque. "They wouldn't let me do the really fun stuff." Madonna pouted, leaning even closer to Carson. "You know, the scene where my character teaches the uptight businessman how to enjoy himself. The studio said it was too hot for theaters." Carson, attempting to maintain control of the conversation, tried steering towards safer territory. "So, this film is a comedy, then?" he asked. Madonna's response left the host momentarily speechless. "Johnny, I can show you exactly what got cut if you want to come back to my hotel later," she said with deliberate wink at the camera. "I'm very hands-on with my character development." The audience reaction was immediate, a mixture of shocked gasps and titillated laughter. Carson, rarely thrown off balance by guests, tugged at his tie in his characteristic gesture of discomfort. Madonna knew exactly what she was doing, recalled Tonight Show writer Raymond Smith. Carson had interviewed beautiful women for decades without losing his cool, but she wasn't just flirting. She was deliberately trying to make him uncomfortable on his own show. It was a power play. The situation escalated when the conversation turned to Madonna's controversial image. Carson made a mild joke about her material girl persona, and Madonna responded with a comment so explicit that the network censor activated the 5-second delay button, resulting in a brief silence that alerted viewers at home that something inappropriate had been said. The booth was in absolute panic, remembered audio engineer Thomas Wilson. The censor had to hit the button 3 more times during that single interview. It was unprecedented for the Tonight Show, which usually stayed well within broadcast standards. Carson, realizing the interview was veering dangerously out of control, attempted to reassert his authority with humor. "I'm starting to think I should have booked the Mother Teresa instead of the material girl tonight," he quipped, earning appreciative laughter from the audience. Madonna, undeterred, responded by placing her hand on Carson's knee, a gesture that crossed one of television's unspoken boundaries. Physical contact between host and guest, unless initiated by Carson himself, was extremely rare on The Tonight Show. "You can handle me, Johnny," she said in a stage whisper clearly intended to be picked up by her microphone. "I promise I won't bite unless you want me to." The camera caught Carson's expression, transforming from professional amusement to genuine discomfort. Ed McMahon, sensing his longtime colleague's unease, interjected with a hearty laugh and a deflecting comment, providing Carson a moment to recalibrate. What viewers at home couldn't see was the frantic activity in the production booth. The executive producer was shouting for us to prepare to cut to commercial if things got any more explicit, revealed Assistant Director James P. Itterson. "In all my years working on the show, that kind of emergency measure had only been discussed, never actually implemented." Carson, drawing on decades of interviewing experience, managed to gradually steer the conversation toward Madonna's music career for the remainder of the segment, but the tension never fully dissipated with Madonna continuing to make suggestive comments and maintaining her physically intimate positioning. When the interview finally ended, Carson's relief was palpable. As he thanked Madonna and the show cut to commercial, cameras caught him wiping his brow in an uncharacteristic display of stress. She made the audience blush in the network panic, observed Tonight Show writer Patricia Bradford. But most impressively, she made Johnny Carson, who had seen it all, genuinely flustered. That was her real accomplishment that night. In the aftermath, network executives reportedly requested that Madonna not be booked again during Carson's tenure. While never publicly commenting on the appearance, Carson was overheard telling a producer, "Next time, let's stick with guests who understand the difference between a Tonight Show and an Amsterdam red light district." Applause. Don Rickles crashed the set mid-taping. Comedian Don Rickles and Johnny Carson shared one of late-night television's most entertaining friendships. Rickles' appearances were always highly anticipated with his mock insult comedy style, and Carson's reactions creating reliable comedy gold. But in 1976, Rickles took their relationship to unprecedented territory by literally hijacking The Tonight Show in the middle of someone else's interview. The evening began routinely enough. Carson was mid-con conversation with actor Robert Blake, then starring in the hit series Beretta, when commotion erupted from backstage. Without warning or introduction, Don Rickles suddenly burst through the curtains, completely uninvited and unscheduled. Johnny, I was just next door doing the Dina Shore show, and I heard you were saying terrible things about me." Rickles bellowed as he charged onto the set, still wearing makeup from his appearance in the neighboring program. Carson's face registered genuine shock. This wasn't a planned bit or prepared segment. Studio audience members reported seeing the host quickly glance off stage toward his producer with a "what is happening" expression before composing himself. "Ladies and gentlemen, apparently Don Rickles has escaped from his handlers." Carson ad-libbed, seamlessly shifting into damage control mode. "Bob, I apologize for this interruption. Don usually has a restraining order preventing him from coming within 500 feet of a television camera, but Rickles was just warming up. Instead of merely making a brief comedic appearance and leaving, he pulled up a chair, physically inserting himself into the ongoing interview with Blake, who appeared increasingly abused by the hijacking of his segment. "Don't mind me, Bobby. I'm just here to make sure Johnny doesn't bore America to death," Rickles announced. "You keep talking about your silly little bird show. I'll just sit here and make sure the audience stays awake." What followed was 20 minutes of unscripted chaos, as Rickles completely dominated the conversation, interrupting both Carson and Blake repeatedly. At one point, he grabbed Carson's famous coffee mug and peered inside. "What is this, Johnny? Water? You cheap bastard. The biggest star in television, and you can't even spring for real coffee for your guests." Rickles then proceeded to walk around Carson's desk, territory that was traditionally off-limits to guests, and began rifling through the host's drawers on live television. "These are private," Carson protested, half-seriously attempting to close a drawer as Rickles pulled out personal items. "Private on television? Nothing's private. Look at this, folks," Rickles exclaimed, holding up a comb and a small mirror he'd found. "The great Johnny Carson is as vain as a peacock." Carson, simultaneously amused and alarmed, tried to regain control of Opie's show. "Don, we do have other guests scheduled tonight. They can wait," Rickles interrupted, turning his attention to Carson's famous set. In a move that left the crew horrified, he began touching various props and set pieces. At one point, actually breaking the rabbit ears on a decorative television prop that sat on a shelf behind Carson's desk. "That's coming out of your paycheck," Carson warned, only half joking as Rickles continued his rampage. "Bill it to NBC." Rickles shot back. "They can afford it. Look at this cheap set. You're the biggest star in television, and they give you furniture from the Salvation Army." What made this incident particularly remarkable was that it occurred during the era of live broadcasting with no ability to edit or control what viewers at home were witnessing. Network executives were reportedly watching in horror as Rickles effectively commandeered their flagship program. The producers were losing their minds in the control booth, recalled camera operator Mitchell Stevens. "This wasn't just a guest going off script. This was a complete takeover of the show. I could see our director frantically signaling to Johnny, trying to figure out how to regain control. Carson, recognizing that fighting the situation would only make for awkward television, made a professional decision to surrender temporarily to the chaos. He leaned back in his chair, lit a cigarette, still permitted on television in that era, and let Rickles run wild. Sometimes Johnny's greatest skill was knowing when to let go of the wheel, observed longtime Tonight Show writer Raymond Smith. With Rickles, he understood that the unpredictability was exactly what made great television, even if it meant his carefully planned show was being demolished in real time. After nearly 20 minutes of Rick's uninvited appearance, during which poor Robert Blake barely managed to complete a single thought about his hit show, Carson finally managed to steer the segment to a commercial break. When cameras returned, Rickles had been persuaded to leave, though not before extracting a promise from Carson to visit him at his upcoming Las Vegas show. The incident became one of the most talked-about moments in Tonight Show history, with viewers calling MBK the next day, not complain, but appraise the unscripted hilarity. Carson, recognizing the entertainment value of what had transpired, referenced the Rickles invasion in his monologue the following evening. "We've increased security around the studio tonight," he told the audience. Don Rickles has been added to the FBI's most wanted list, and we've installed a new alarm system that's triggered by the sound of insults and flop sweat. While the appearance might have infuriated network executives and producers, it cemented the Carson-Rickles relationship as one of television's great comedic partnerships. It also demonstrated why live television in the era possessing electricity that many feel is missing from today's more tightly controlled talk show environment. As Carson later explained to a reporter asking about the incident with Dawn, it was controlled chaos, but just barely. "Now we're all going to play a game. I'm sure you all know it called Simon," says, "and this here Simon." Shelley Winters screamed at another guest. Two-time Academy Award winner, Shelley Winters was known throughout Hollywood for her volcanic temper and unfiltered opinions long before she appeared on The Tonight Show in 1975. But even by her standards, what transpired during her segment with fellow guest Truman Capote created one of the most uncomfortable confrontations in talk show history. The trouble began innocently enough. Carson had first interviewed Capote, who was promoting his controversial, unfinished novel, Answered Prayers, excerpts of which had just been published in Esquire magazine. The book's thinly veiled portrayals of New York society figures had scandalized the city's elite, and Capote was wrying in the uproar. When Winters joined the conversation, taking the seat next to Capote, Carson attempted a light-hearted transition, asking her if she had read Capote's controversial work. What he couldn't have anticipated was that Winters had not only read it, but had recognized herself in one of Capote's thinly disguised characters, a portrayal she found deeply unflattering. "I've read enough to know slander when I see it," Winters responded, her voice immediately rising in volume.